Hello everybody, and today, guys, I'm finally doing it. I am ranking the entire Godzilla franchise. Took long enough, but for the franchise 70th year anniversary, I am gonna cover and rank every Toho Godzilla movies. I'm not including the Monsterverse in this video, just to let people know, because I already did that ranking. But anyway, this video is going to take a long time. I've got a lot to go through, so I won't talk in depth about each movie. So anyway, let's start the ranking. Alright, in last place, in my opinion, is the anime trilogy. Now, I know the anime trilogy does have some of its fans, but in my opinion, when I first watched it on Netflix, I didn't like it at all. I thought that it was just boring, it was bland, it was really bad, and it was also kind of weird, especially Godzilla being like this plant-like creature, I think, but anyways, I still think that the Godzilla is really cool in the anime trilogy, but I just think the design is just a little bit too, generic a bit, just in my opinion. But anyways, at least we get the tallest Godzilla of all time in this trilogy. But still though, the main character was alright, but I just thought he was really bland and just also was a wasted character by the end. But the trilogy itself, and especially what they handled with the other monsters like Ghidorah and Mechagodzilla, especially Mechagodzilla, that was such a waste of character. But I don't think the designs were that good, and I thought that they just weren't really that interesting as well. So this is my ranking of the trilogy. Last place would be Edge of City Battle. This one was just boring as hell. I mean, the entire film, Mechagodzilla isn't even in this movie. It sucks. Then we have Planet Eater, which I thought was alright, but still wasn't that great of a conclusion. And I think the best one out of the series is definitely Monster Planet, but still though, it has a lot of, iffy things about it. All in all, this was a wasted trilogy, and I don't like this trilogy. I think it's a waste. It's not that I hate anime. I don't hate anime. I actually like anime, but still though, I just thought this was just a weird, and it just wasn't really of a good trilogy. Now getting into the actual films, we have Godzilla's Revenge or All Monsters Attack, and yeah, I think we all knew that this movie would be at the lower end of the list, and yeah, I do agree. This movie is just bloody weird, like, I'm not kidding. This movie is mostly a Minya movie, mostly, and Minya talks in this movie with the dub and also the American dub and the Japanese dub absolutely annoy me for the dub of this character, and also the young kid as well. Just one of the worst kid characters in the Godzilla film, especially that this is a dream. Like, I hate how this movie is just all a dream. Gabra, I would say, is alright, but still though, his roar is annoying and his design just looks kind of strange as well, really weird. But I just hate how this movie just takes place in the young kid's mind. I mean, that's pretty much all this film is. And at the end, there's like this Home Alone like scene, like conclusion at the end. It was just so weird. Like, I don't recommend this film to anyone. At least it's only an hour. I think that's the only good thing about this film is the runtime, just 1 hour. If you have an hour to kill on garbage, then probably recommend this one, but it's not a good movie in my opinion. Again, I know a lot of show fans are going to hate me for this, but I just think Eberhov the Deep is the most boring Godzilla movie out of them all. Even boringer than Godzilla's Revenge in my own honest opinion. Godzilla's suit, it looks kind of terrible, but it gets even worse by Son of Godzilla. But the new monster introduced to this film is Ebera, which I think is an okay monster, pretty cool monster and pretty underrated, but still though, it's just a giant lobster. I mean, there's nothing special about him at all. Also, Mothra's in this movie as well. Whilst the human characters are mostly comic relief in this film, they still kind of fall flat a little bit. And there is this one weird scene with Godzilla where Godzilla literally is attracted to a girl in this movie. I mean, I know this picture was for King Kong, but seeing Godzilla be attracted to an actual human female is just kind of weird, and was obviously just for King Kong, not Godzilla. But anyway, I would say the fight scenes and the ending is the best part about this film, but other than that, this movie was just mostly boring. I don't really remember a single thing about this film after finishing it, to be honest. I wouldn't recommend it. Okay, this is a hot take here, but I don't like Godzilla raids again. I'm sorry to all the classic Showa fans. I do think that Godzilla's design is really good in this film, don't get me wrong, it's okay. I wouldn't say it's the best design, I just think it's alright. But this movie gets the first introduction of Anguirus and the first ever monster that Godzilla has ever fought on screen. And Anguirus here looks okay. I wouldn't say it's the best design though. I definitely think they improved it later on in other films, but still though, Anguirus is alright. But my only biggest problem with this film are the fight scenes. The fight scenes, they're alright, but they move so fast, the fight scenes. Like, it's really, like, it's fast-paced, the fight scenes, when you watch the movie. And also the ending is kind of similar to the first Godzilla movie, but it's very different, the ending. And it's not that emotional when compared to the first Godzilla movie's ending, which really sucks about the ending to this movie. Anyway, you can definitely tell that this was just a cash grab that was released after the first movie. I mean, this movie is kind of important to the franchise, and I appreciate it a little bit, but still though, as a movie, it's just not really that great, in my opinion. Okay, this is the entry where I think a lot of people are going to hate me for this, but I'm sorry. I am very sorry. I wanted to love Destroy All Monsters, but the movie is just, the entire runtime is just so boring and drags so long. And the monsters fight scenes, they are scattered around through the film, but they're not that much in the movie. It's mostly we follow the humans. If you want a giant monster battle scenes, I mean, there is it in the movie, but it's only the final 20 minutes of the movie. Anyway, Godzilla's design definitely is much more improved in this movie, and we'll see this design later on in this Showa series. Ghidorah's in this movie, but he only shows up at the very end, and his introduction isn't even that powerful compared to Ghidorah, the three-headed monster. Most of the movie follows around the aliens that are controlling the monster, the key locks, which in my opinion are not interesting compared to the Exilians in this invasion of Astro Monster and in Godzilla Final Wars. All in all, I would say just watch the last 20 minutes of this movie, but other than that, the rest of the movie was just kind of a bore fest with the humans, and it just wasn't really that interesting. I would recommend just watching the final battle, that's it. This might be one of the weirdest movies in the Millennium era, in my opinion, and that is Godzilla vs. Megaguirus. All in all, I don't really have much to say about this film. It's another Godzilla vs. movie, or Godzilla vs. Giant Bug movie. I mean, I kind of like Megaguirus. I do kind of like the design, but still, though, it's not a rememberable monster, in my opinion. I don't really think Megaguirus isn't a good monster. It's probably because I don't like giant bugs. But we get to see Godzilla do, like, this jump thingy where he jumps on Megaguirus. Which that scene is just laughable. In a good way, I meant. There's actually some horror in this movie with Megaguirus literally mutilating people, which was kind of gross, but still though, we don't see that many horror in Godzilla. But all in all, Godzilla vs. Megaguirus is okay, but I just don't that much like this movie. I just think it's kind of lower end Godzilla movie. Alright, Son of Godzilla. This one was actually alright in my opinion, but still though, does have its issues. Especially introducing the Son of Godzilla being Minilla. And, I mean, Manilla's alright in this film. He looks nothing like Godzilla, but I heard rumors that he's adopted, so still though. I don't know, I don't hate Minilla in this movie. I think Manilla's fine, but Godzilla's design just one of the worst designs in the entire Showa series, in my opinion. I mean, just look at those eyes. But anyway, we get introduced to Kumonga in this movie, which is a giant spider that will appear in some other Godzilla movies. And we also get introduced to Kamacuras as well in this movie, which Godzilla obviously absolutely defeats these guys. I do think the best part about this film is the ending. It leaves on an emotional note and it's one of the saddest endings in the Godzilla franchise. Still think casual audiences will find this silly, and in my opinion, it's just kind of mediocre. It's okay. Tokyo SOS. I'm sorry about this, but I just found this one to be insanely boring. Another one in the Millennium era, this time a sequel to Godzilla against Mechagodzilla, which Godzilla is obviously out for revenge and is pissed at Kiryu for causing his scars. And we also have Mothra in this movie, which I don't really that much like Mothra in this movie. I just think she wasn't needed in this movie. I think only for the ending, but that's really it. Anyways, I just found this film to be boring as well with the main human stuff. But I mean, the fight scenes are obviously the best part about this movie. Don't get me wrong, and I actually really love the ending to this film as well. This is just one of those sequels where it just isn't necessary, in my own opinion. Yep, everyone's gonna hate me for this, but anyways, I don't care. This is my list. But Ghidorah the three-headed monster. I know this was the introduction of Ghidorah. I know that a lot of people love this film just because it introduces Ghidorah for the first time. But this movie, I gotta give... Yeah, I'm just saying this right now. This movie just wasn't my thing, in my opinion. Like, this movie, I know it introduces Ghidorah and Rodan. This movie was just silly as well. It wasn't really of a great introduction of Ghidorah, really. I mean, this movie is fun. I do really enjoy this film from time to time. And it is important, but I just don't think this is the best Godzilla movie. One thing that makes this movie more interesting is that it's more of a space movie compared to a Godzilla movie. The characters are likable in this movie, with my favourite character being Glenn, who actually isn't Japanese and speaks English throughout the film. We also have the Exilians, just the first ever aliens on screen, which I think are definitely really good villains. And their design is really iconic as well in the franchise. However, this movie does a bit fall flat, however, especially because Godzilla isn't really the focus of the film, he's more of the backdrop. But still though, who can't forget Godzilla's iconic dance scene in this movie? All in all, it's a good time. It's just a bit too cheesy, and it's not really that much about Godzilla, but still though, this is an interesting entry in the series, and I do recommend it for all sci-fi fans. And we're finally getting into the Heisei series with Godzilla vs. Mothra. Now, I don't hate this movie, I actually really enjoy this film. However, I would say out of the Heisei series, it's definitely the weakest one. Mothra is alright. I do think it's one of the best designs of Mothra, in my honest opinion, in the franchise. But we get the introduction of Batra, which I think is badass. One of the best Godzilla villains that has only appeared in this one movie and has never showed up again. The worst part about this film, in my opinion, might be the ending where Batra teams up with Mothra to destroy Godzilla or trap Godzilla in the mortar. But anyway, I do think this is an enjoyable film, and I actually do kind of recommend it. But still though, I wouldn't say it's my film. Okay, I can explain why Godzilla vs. Megalon isn't the worst Godzilla movie. For one, obviously it's really fun. Obviously it's nostalgia for me, because Godzilla vs. Megalon was probably one of the first Showa movies I ever watched. Godzilla, and particularly the tail slide scene, I can play that scene over and over again. To even the villains, Gigan and Megalon. While Gigan I would say is the weakest part about this film, Megalon's okay. But the best part about this movie is obviously freaking Jet Jaguar. I remember watching Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla, and I thought it was alright. I didn't think it was that great of a film. However, I do still love the effects in this movie because it has that Heisei charm in the movie. And it's still a great entry in the Heisei Godzilla series. Little Godzilla has grown up and looks like Baby Yoda a bit. Honestly, I just think it's a part of that Baby Yoda trend a little bit, just because of how cute it looks. But still though, it looks very cute, not to lie. But we get the introduction of Space Godzilla, probably one of my favourite villains and the best part of this movie. Space Godzilla is a menace in this movie, one of my favourite Godzilla villains of all time. But we also get introduction of Moguro, who wasn't in the Godzilla film, was in the Mysterians, but still makes a return in the Godzilla film. Definitely one of the most underrated kaiju that hasn't appeared ever since. Anyways, Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla, I think was an alright film. It might be the most underrated film in the Heisei series. Definitely Space Godzilla is the best part of this film, but I mean this film, not gonna lie, was just kind of boring. Godzilla makes a return in the new era called the Millennium Era, and with Godzilla 2000 or Godzilla Millennium. I really like the design of Godzilla in this movie, even though he's a bit small, but I really like the dorsal plates on him, especially the way they look and they're purple. However, this is my opinion, the CG in this movie just looks kind of terrible. I mean, there is some shots of Godzilla swimming where you can tell it looks CG, it just looks kind of fake. But Godzilla isn't the only creature, we also have the Millennium, which is pretty much this alien-like organism ship that eventually turns at the end of the movie into Orga. Definitely one of my favourite monsters and one of the most underrated monsters in the Godzilla franchise. I definitely think Orga definitely needs to appear in some piece of Godzilla media eventually, because he is super underrated and he almost killed Godzilla as well. Almost sucked the life out of Godzilla, should I say. My only problem with this film is that at times it just feels kind of dull and boring. When it comes to Godzilla and Orga's scenes, I do think they're very interesting and it's a lot of fun to have. A lot of show fans are going to be angry at me for this. King Kong vs. Godzilla. Rewatching it, I didn't really that much enjoy this film. This movie is fun, don't get me wrong. I especially really like the human cast in this film, just because of how comic relief the human cast in this film is. This movie is more of a comedy, but then when it gets to Godzilla and Kong fighting, it is just awesome. Don't get me wrong, I do think this movie was important to the Godzilla and King Kong franchise just because it reunites these two in a battle. And honestly, I don't care who wins at the end. This was just a spectacular battle to have on the big screen. King Kong's obviously the main protagonist, and I'm sorry, or I think many people agree with this, Kong just looks so stupid in this movie. His face and as well as his body, God, it just looks bad. I don't know why, but I think that Godzilla in this movie looks definitely much better than Kong. I especially love this design. However, he claps all the time in the movie, which I think is hilarious, but it adds to the movie's cheese. I don't know what was up with Kong, but Godzilla was definitely the best in terms of suit design in the film. But seeing these two fight on the big screen was just amazing. My only problem with this movie is, again, it is kind of cheesy. and it takes a little longer for Godzilla and King Kong to eventually fight. But still though, I do recommend King Kong vs. Godzilla. Definitely one of the most important movies in cinema history, I'm not gonna lie. Honestly, one of my favorite Godzilla vs. Ghidorah movies is, besides Ghidorah the three-headed monster is gonna anger some people, because it's Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah. And that's just because, obviously, it's the Heisei era, which is one of my favorite eras, but also King Ghidorah, in my opinion, is probably the best in this movie. The Heisei Ghidorah is one of my favorite Ghidorah designs, and one of my favorite Ghidorahs. That's besides the Monsterverse Ghidorah. But this is the first introduction of Godzillasaurus, which the humans time travel. Yeah, this is a time travel movie, back to Godzilla when he was just a dinosaur. Anyway, the Godzillasaurus is defeated, and we also get to see these three little things called Dorats, which eventually turn into King Ghidorah. Mecha King Ghidorah's design is probably one of the most underrated Ghidorah designs, because I don't think many people like a mechanical version of King Ghidorah and much prefer Mecha Godzilla, but I do think Mecha King Ghidorah just looks amazing in this movie. Definitely one of the most underappreciated Godzilla films, but I still really enjoy it, particularly because there is time travel in this movie. Bring out the hate, Showa fans, but it doesn't really matter because I still actually really enjoy Terror of Mechagodzilla. This movie, while it doesn't have much Godzilla in it, definitely has a great human story to it, especially with the scientist and his daughter, which I do think is very sad and a tragic story. Obviously, I won't spoil it, but damn, definitely dark. Mechagodzilla obviously returns in this film because his terror has finally returned on Godzilla ever since Godzilla destroyed him in the first Mechagodzilla film. But he also joins forces with a monster called Titanosaurus, which honestly I do think is a cool design, but the roar is just super annoying in my own opinion. I don't like how the way Titanosaurus is also defeated at the end of the film, getting defeated by the humans except for Godzilla. Definitely a disappointing ending to this monster. But this movie is still enjoyable and is definitely one of my favorites in the Showa era and is definitely a must-watch. I'll definitely recommend this movie after watching Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla. Okay, this is probably one of the most controversial debates to this day, but I actually think that Godzilla 1998 is actually a good monster movie. I know that a lot of Godzilla fans are probably not going to like this opinion, but I think that Godzilla 1998 is actually a good film, and that if you used to hate Godzilla 1998 and you still do, just grow up. I'm serious. Just stop complaining. This film came out like nearly 30 years ago. Yes, I know it does look nothing like Godzilla. I do agree with that. It looks nothing like Godzilla, but this movie at least is better than some of the other Godzilla films at the end of the list, and it's also more watchable and more entertaining than the others as well. And I know there's going to be a lot of things that a lot of people don't like, especially the cast and the main characters, which are portrayed by most of the characters from The Simpsons, and Ferris Bueller as well is there. And they don't like the baby Godzillas in the film, which are pretty much just plain rip-offs of the raptors from Jurassic Park, which, yeah, I can kind of agree with that, and I don't really like the scene with the babyzillas. But this is still an entertaining film, and it was one of the first Godzilla movies I ever saw, so I know it's going to be a bit crazy here, but I'm going to put it in the top 20. Sorry, but it's just the truth. I used to not like this movie at all, but rewatching it, Godzilla vs. Mothra, I actually really enjoyed it. I do really like the story to it, and the characters and the monsters, particularly Godzilla. I love this design and how the way it looks. I especially like the scene where we get to first see Godzilla as he comes out of the sand. It's definitely one of Godzilla's most iconic introductions. Then we have the first introduction of Mothra in the Godzilla franchise, which I know this was back in the time, but for some odd reason, Mothra just looks stiff in lots of shots. But that's just something to expect from the old Godzilla films in the Showa era. Also, I didn't like the ending to the film as well. I don't like how Godzilla gets defeated by two little turds, which is why I didn't like this film. But obviously, viewing back on it, I actually really like the ending, because Godzilla's supposed to be the villain of the film. But anyways, I had a fun time with this film, and I actually do recommend it to anyone who probably is starting to get into the Godzilla franchise. This was one of the first Heisei movies I ever watched, and honestly, I still love it to this day. That's Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2. Super Mechagodzilla honestly isn't my favorite Mechagodzilla design just because of how chubby he is. But I mean, still though, it just looks alright. However, I really love Rodan. This might be one of my favorite Rodan designs just because of how he looks a lot like a pterodactyl a lot, which I think is really awesome. But this is our first introduction to Baby Godzilla. That is right, no Manila, Baby Godzilla himself. And honestly, he is very cute. I'm not going to lie about that. I especially love the ending to this film. A very sad ending, but still though, what a kick-ass ending to this movie. I just think it's amazing. So anyway, this movie was a part of my childhood, and for that reason, it's definitely one of my favorite films in the Godzilla series. I know a lot of Godzilla fans don't like this film, but I'm going to be honest, I love this film because it was one of my favourite Showa movies when I was a child. And particularly my favourite monster of all time is in this movie, and it's an introduction to the series, and that's Gigan. Gigan is badass, one of my favourite Godzilla villains. And also King Ghidorah makes a return, which I don't know why Ghidorah was entered into this film. Guess for another monster to team up with Gigan. But I mean, still though, Gigan kicks Godzilla's ass in this movie. Godzilla's suit also looks a bit rotting as well because of the amount of time they used him on films. But Godzilla talks in this movie. That is right, Godzilla talks to Anguirus in this movie, and Anguirus also talks as well. Obviously, the Showa Anguirus makes a return in this movie from Destroy All Monsters, and honestly, I just love this design. This also is one of the most brutal Godzilla movies of all time as well, with blood splattering everywhere. There's even the Godzilla Tower in this movie, which I think is just awesome. I know a lot of people don't like that, I just think it's awesome. But also, there are space alien cockroaches as well. I didn't make that up, I'm serious. So all in all, this is a fun time, and I recommend it to all the Godzilla fans. And I know this movie isn't for everyone, but still though, definitely one of my favorites. I don't know why the title is very different for this film, but anyways, Godzilla Against Mechagodzilla was the first to start another new franchise in the Millennium era. This movie isn't really nothing to write home about, but I do still really enjoy this one and was one of my favorites as a kid. Kiryu is my favorite Mechagodzilla design in my opinion. I think Kiryu is probably the best design out of every Mechagodzilla. And what I really like about Kiryu is that he is kind of made up from the bones and all the remains of the original Godzilla from 1954, which I do think is very awesome to see a robot Godzilla that is, made from the remains of the Godzilla from the first film, which I do think is very interesting. Also, Godzilla in this movie is another villain, this Godzilla as well, which is what I really like about it. And the design's very good as well. This will lead to a satisfying end to the film, which I do recommend Godzilla Against Mechagodzilla. However, I do think it's not really a film I really recommend because it's kind of bland for some people. But maybe watch some other Godzilla films and then after that watch this one. But anyway, on to the top 10. Alright, now some Godzilla fans are probably going to be like, this will be a bit of a controversial take here, but I really enjoy Godzilla vs. Hedorah. It's one of my favourite Godzilla films because it's probably one of the more experimental and one of the more horror Godzilla films. I mean, this movie is just so weird and it goes completely bonkers. I don't even know what to say. But the monster of the day we're talking about is Hedorah, which I do think is very interesting. I especially like how this monster is spawned from pollution in the sea, which the movie is kind of an environmental message about pollution, which spawns Hedorah, this terrifying monster. And I'm not kidding, Hedorah might be one of the scariest monsters in the Showa era. I am not kidding, it's not just Godzilla, but it's actually humans that suffer by Hedorah. And we do get to see some body horror imagery of people getting literally melted by Hedorah. Definitely one of the most disturbing elements of the movie that we have never seen in a Godzilla film. We also see these little short animated things about Hedorah. I'm not too sure what they're supposed to represent, but I'm pretty sure they represent news coverage of Hedorah. I'm not really too sure. But the main characters are also really likable as well, especially the scientist. The child's alright, but it's your typical child in a Godzilla film. But as for the Big G himself, obviously the Showa era Godzilla suit is used here. And, well, all I can say about Godzilla is that he flies in one of the scenes. I am not kidding you. Definitely one of the most weirdest moments in the franchise. But anyways, I do recommend Godzilla vs. Hedorah. It's not for everyone, but I still find some enjoyment out of it. And I think it's one of the best in the Showa era in my personal opinion. We are back to another dark and serious Godzilla movie this time around with The Return of Godzilla. And I'm not talking about the 1985 film. This movie definitely bring back Godzilla to its darker roots, with especially kind of like a remake of the 1954 movie quite a lot. Godzilla obviously doesn't fight any villains, but the only villain that I would say kind of fights is the Super X in this movie, which is one of the most iconic vehicles in the Godzilla franchise, one of the most powerful weapons to ever stop Godzilla. But this ending is also very sad as well, with Godzilla falling into a volcano, with Godzilla screaming and crying as well. The Godzilla design itself looks like a blend of the 1954 and the Heisei design that we'll see later on. And I think it's kind of an underrated design in my own opinion. I actually quite like the Godzilla design. Anyway, I actually do recommend this film to anyone, especially Godzilla fans. But if you're trying to get into Godzilla, this is one movie to watch as well. Okay, hear me out. I actually love Godzilla Final Wars. It's one of my favorite Godzilla movies, and it was one of the first Godzilla movies I ever watched. It's like a modern version of Destroy All Monsters, but more goofier and insane, which is what makes this movie a fun time. And Godzilla in this movie is a badass. I am not kidding you. Godzilla destroys everybody in this movie. I am not kidding. Every single monster in this film, just in a single second, just gets handed by Godzilla. Even his friends Anguirus and Rodan and King Caesar couldn't face against Godzilla and are enemies to him as well in this film. But we also get the 1998 Godzilla. Yes, that's right, Zilla makes a return as kind of like a joke because, I mean, he gets easily defeated by Godzilla, of course, showing Toho's revenge. But anyway, there's just so many monsters in this movie I cannot even explain. And even minions in this movie, which, well, I would say is the weak part of the movie. But then we get to the human characters, which are very solid, and I really like the human scenes, particularly the main character, and Don Fry himself playing Captain Gordon, and such a badass character. Also, the human characters just keep on fighting, just like the Matrix as well. But my favorite character is the Exilian commander himself, which in my opinion is one of the most funniest characters in the movie, and is one of the most over-the-top villains, which makes him so awesome. But I do recommend Godzilla Final Wars. Of course, it's not for everyone, but in my opinion, this is just my opinion, it's just one of my favorite Godzilla movies. Godzilla vs. Biollante might be one of the most tragic and one of the most badass Godzilla movies of all time. The story is kinda dark as well, where a scientist loses his daughter in a tragic accident, causing him to mix her daughter's DNA with Godzilla cells and a rose, causing into the monstrous beast known as Biollante, probably one of the best Godzilla villains in my personal opinion. Even though in this film, she doesn't really seem like a villain in my opinion, and more like a tragic monster, and more like a Frankenstein creation. She first starts off as a rose form and eventually attacks Godzilla, and then eventually turns into a crocodilian type plant monster creature. But speaking of Godzilla, Godzilla's design in this movie has definitely changed. He's risen out of the volcano and is more angrier than ever. Anyway, I do recommend Godzilla vs. Biollante. Definitely one of my favorites, and one of my favorite in the Heisei series. This movie is one of the most terrifying and most experimental takes on Godzilla of all time, that being Shin Godzilla. This movie is kind of like a modern take of Godzilla 1954, but the themes and messages have kind of changed, as well as Godzilla himself, as this movie is kind of the inspiration of the Fukushima disaster. And it's also a political movie as well, with characters discussing on how to destroy Godzilla, which isn't new and has started since the franchise began, because lots of people have been thinking about how to destroy Godzilla. As for Godzilla, Godzilla is absolutely terrifying in this movie. He takes two forms in this movie, which look kind of goofy, but still look very scary and uncanny. But that leads to Godzilla's final form, which is amazing. I love how he looks exactly like a zombified version of Godzilla. As for the human cast, I think they are interesting, but I do agree with some people that I think some of the scenes are just a bit too boring in my own opinion. But it fits well with the cast of characters, which I do think they're good actors, especially the main character. It pretty much shows a commentary on ministers and prime ministers and what they would do when faced in an attack on the country, just like Godzilla. Also, the ending of this film just leaves everything open for possibilities as well, which is why I think is one of the best endings in the franchise. And I forgot to mention Godzilla's atomic breath. Damn, that is that's just such an amazing scene. All in all, Shin Godzilla, I do recommend it to anyone, especially if you want to get into the Godzilla franchise and you haven't seen any film. I do recommend this one. Okay, now I know a lot of Godzilla fans They think this movie's okay and they like it, but it's not in their top 5. But in my opinion, I think that Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla is definitely one of my favorite Godzilla movies, especially in the Showa era. It's my favorite. This movie is just cheesy and it's thrilling, but it's so much fun at the same time, just like the Showa movies are. They're fun, especially this movie introducing the audience to Godzilla's most popular villain, Mechagodzilla. That is right, this is the introduction of Mechagodzilla, who first disguises himself as the real Godzilla and ends up breaking Angurus's jaw. Not breaking it, just ripping it open like King Kong style. That scene is just brutal. Also, this might be one of the most goriest Godzilla movies. I mean, I am not kidding you. Godzilla bleeds in this movie a couple of times by Mechagodzilla. This is definitely in that era where Showa films were going pretty dark territories, besides them being like catering towards kids still back then. But also we get the introduction of King Caesar, which I think is a very underrated kaiju in the fan base. I especially really like the song before he gets woken up. That song rocks. I don't care what people say. I really like it. The plot with the humans in this movie goes everywhere. First it wants to be a Bond movie with the humans, but then it turns into Planet of the Apes. Yeah, I'm not kidding. This is definitely one of the weirdest films in terms of human stuff, but that's what makes it entertaining. I recommend Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla for anyone, and I definitely think this one might be my favorite in the Showa era. And now we have the title that I can't pronounce because it's too bloody long, GMK. That's what I'm going to refer to it now as, GMK. One of the best in the Millennium era and is my favourite film in that era. I just really love this film. I especially really like the approach of this film because this film is very different with its approach, unlike the other Godzilla films. Like, for one, obviously Godzilla himself, he is the best part about this film because he's a villain, but also it turns his origins around. This time he comes from the souls of World War II victims this time around and soldiers that get revenge on Japan just for not remembering them. I especially like Godzilla's eyes. I think that's probably what makes his design so creepy and scary. And Baragon, I mean, just look at him. I want to keep him as a pet. And then we move on to Mothra and King Ghidorah, which in my opinion are alright. However, I do think the design, I think this is the CG mostly, it just doesn't look that great. King Ghidorah this time is a good guy for some odd reason, and I think the design of Ghidorah is pretty basic, but still though, I think turning Ghidorah into a good guy actually kind of works in this movie. But anyway, that is pretty much GMK. What do I think? I just think it's amazing. I especially like the director of the film who did the Heisei Gamera series, Shusuke Kaneko. Did really good at making this movie very different from any other Godzilla films, which is why I really like this one. All I can say is, what a way to finish an era. That's right, Godzilla vs. Destroyer or Godzilla vs. Destroyer is the best in the Heisei era, and it's probably the best final Godzilla movie in a Godzilla era. So, obviously we know this isn't the end of Godzilla, because Godzilla never dies, and I wouldn't be here if the franchise ended on this one movie. But still though, if the franchise ended on this one movie, I still would have been satisfied, because this is one hell of a way to end Godzilla as a whole, as a franchise. In this movie, Godzilla is going to die, and this will be his last film, and he turns into Burning Godzilla, one of the best Godzilla designs, and I like how the way it lights up a little bit in the suit as well. It would have been helpful Kapichira Satsuma, who was in the suit. Then we have Destroyer, which is probably one of the best Godzilla villains of all time, especially in the Heisei era. He's one of the most iconic monsters in the franchise. He was born from, obviously, the Oxygen Destroyer that killed the first Godzilla, which I think is very awesome. And he just looks evil. He looks like he came straight from hell. Probably one of the best Godzilla villains to ever face off against Godzilla. And he really is a villain, because he is a menace to Godzilla. And Godzilla Jr., which, yeah, this scene is so sad. Godzilla Jr. also makes a return of little Godzilla, but he's no longer little. He now looks exactly like his father. And now, honestly, looks a lot like Godzilla, because in the last films, he looks kind of like Godzilla, but to be honest, he just looks more Manila looking, like, you know, Manila. This is definitely one of the best Godzilla designs, especially for Godzilla's son. Definitely looks exactly like his father, unlike the previous. I can't talk without the elephant in the room, that being Godzilla's death. Yes, that is right. Godzilla dies in this movie, and it is so sad. One of the saddest moments, because we get to see Godzilla literally melt down and literally die with Akira Ifukube's iconic music playing in the background. And that's pretty much the end of Godzilla. This was talked about a lot back in then. News stations were talking about it. They even had a memorial for Godzilla in Japan. I am not kidding. They actually had a memorial for a fictional monster. I mean, that shows that Japan really cares about Godzilla. But this was everywhere at the time Godzilla's death, spreading from news station to news station, and even found its way to the States that Godzilla was about to die, with hopes for the new American Godzilla, which we know how that turned out. But if you want to think that Godzilla's not dead, well, at the end of the film, we see Godzilla show up, which is supposed to be Godzilla Jr. In my opinion, however, I reckon this isn't Godzilla returning. This is just Godzilla's soul as the franchise as a whole for the ending. But anyways, without doubt, Godzilla vs. Destroyer is one of the best Godzilla movies in the franchise, in the Heisei era. But it's also one of the best final Godzilla films. I would recommend it to anyone. However, I would probably recommend playing this film after as a final film. Definitely one of the most emotionally driven Godzilla movies. Look, now I know it's a bit biased and expected at this point that the original Godzilla will be somewhere in the top 3, but I still think that the original Godzilla film is definitely worth checking out. And it's a classic even to this day. Now I know that there is the American version called Godzilla King of the Monsters, but I would skip that because I think the original 1954 film is definitely the best one and is worth checking out with its more darker themes to it. Film came out after World War II and after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, creating the fear on what if a giant monster was awoken by those bombs and began attacking the city. And ever since then, it has become a staple of pop culture. This is why the first Godzilla movie is so special, because it's not just Godzilla himself, it's mostly the themes of the film. The characters are amazing as well. Kyohei Homana, played by Takashi Shimura, and Emiko, played by Momoko Kochi, and longtime Godzilla cast Akira Takarada, playing Hideto Ogata. And of course, my favorite character and the most tragic character in the Godzilla franchise, Dr. Serizawa, who is played by Akihiro Hirata, who is a tragic character and definitely one of the best characters in the franchise and the most recognizable, probably by his eye patch, as well as his sacrifice that he makes at the end of the movie. All the human cast in this film is definitely the best of the film, that's besides Godzilla. But what about Godzilla himself? Well, obviously Godzilla is awesome in this film, but I would have to say this, I'm very sorry about this to some of the Godzilla fans here, but in some shots, I think we can all agree, Godzilla just looks a bit too goofy, especially with the eyes. I don't know what was up with the eyes, but yeah, it looks kind of silly in some shots. You can definitely tell by watching the movie. But anyway, this film is 70 years old, so I won't complain that. But anyway, talking about the Godzilla suit, the suit was done by Hiro Nakajima, which sounds awesome to be in a giant monster suit stomping on cities, but in reality, it was hell for him, as he kept on passing out in the suit, and it was hard to move with him inside. And he would do this for the next 20 years playing Godzilla, until 1972. But Godzilla in this movie looks really terrifying. Even though the design looks a bit basic to this day, the suit some of the times just looks a bit scary and uncanny a bit at the time, which definitely really helps with it, with its black and white image, in my opinion, of the film. I especially like the scene where we see Godzilla on the hill for the first time as he roars. It's so terrifying for his first introduction. And that's pretty much the original Godzilla film. I will talk about this film in more detail, especially the history behind it. But all in all, it's a classic monster movie worth checking out. And by no surprise, the number 1 film is Godzilla -1. Yes, the newest Godzilla movie is number 1, or one of the newest Godzilla movies. Obviously, I don't know what has to be said about this movie. I did review this film ever since it came out, and with spoilers and stuff, but Godzilla -1 is not just one of the best Godzilla movies ever, but it's one of the best kaiju movies of all time. I think that this movie is awesome. Takashi Yamazaki, who is a part of the Godzilla franchise for a little while now, did a really good job with this movie. This is especially a movie that's not really about Godzilla, actually. It's about the human cast, particularly Shikishima, who's a really excellent character and one of the best characters in the franchise of all time, with this really awesome redemption arc And it's kind of sad to watch him go through all this pain and suffering, losing everyone around him, and the monstrosity that he has to battle against, that being Godzilla himself, being a menace targeting him most of the film. Godzilla in this movie is terrifying. I'm not kidding you. This Godzilla is mean and just a straight up villain in this movie. Even though I think the design is okay, it's a bit basic, but still though, it's still a classic Godzilla design. But I especially love the atomic breath scene. That is one of the best scenes of all the Godzilla franchise, in my opinion. Or should I say atomic nuclear breath, because it's technically a nuclear bomb that explodes after that. But yeah, Godzilla in this movie is just one of the best Godzillas. He's just so scary and so terrifying in this movie. And that's why Godzilla Minus One is my favorite. I especially like this villain approach to Godzilla, especially the more realism story. And I know there's going to be a sequel to this film, but I mean, to be honest, I wouldn't really want to see a sequel, because this, I think, is one of the best movies of all time, and I don't think it needs a sequel. So yeah, Godzilla Minus One is my #1 favorite Godzilla movie. Whew, that was a lot of movies to go through. Oh. Well, guys, we have done it. I have ranked every single Godzilla film. Thank you all so much for watching. What is your favorite Godzilla movie of all time? Leave in the comment section down below with your rankings. And anyway, it's the Big G's 70th year anniversary. Long live the King.